Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. It's Thursday, the 13th of June, and my name is Brian Liddy. And this evening I'm joined by the now retired MSP Maureen Watt. Maureen, thank you once again for giving us part of your evening this evening.
You're welcome. Nice to see you again, Brian.
Thank you, likewise. So here is today's Ukraine update, and today is day 841. A Russian ballistic missile strike on Ukraine's southern city of Kryvyi on Wednesday killed 9 people and injured 29, including 5 children, Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko said. The deadliest attack in weeks damaged an administrative building and an apartment block, Ukraine's military command said on the Telegram messaging app. Russia engaged in a deliberate pattern of starvation tactics during the 85-day siege of the Ukrainian city of Mariupol in early 2022, which amounted to a war crime, according to fresh analysis submitted to the International Criminal Court. The conclusion is at the heart of a dossier in the process of being submitted to the ICC in The Hague by the lawyers Global Rights Compliance, working in conjunction with the Ukrainian government. A dramatic expansion of entities exposed to US sanctions for helping the Russian economy and an EU-led $50 billion loan to ease the financial burden on Ukraine will be at the centre of discussions at a G7 leaders summit in Puglia in Italy starting today. The meeting is being billed by the US State Department as an opportunity to send a message to Russia of Western stamina. The G7 would also like to Trump-proof its decisions as much as possible ahead of the US election in November. To that end, NATO is set to take over coordination of arms deliveries to Ukraine from the US, the alliance's chief said on Wednesday, in a bid to safeguard military aid mechanism ahead of a possible second Trump presidency. Quote, I expect that ministers will approve a plan for NATO to lead the coordination of security assistance and training to Ukraine, said Jens Stoltenberg to reporters on the eve of a 2-day meeting of NATO defence ministers in Brussels. Stoltenberg also highlighted the alliance's efforts to adapt its capabilities to current security threats, taking note of Russia's latest nuclear rhetoric and drills. US sanctions against Russia forced an immediate suspension of trading in dollars and euros on its leading financial marketplace, the Moscow Exchange. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has directly caused or paved the way to the emission of 175 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, or CO2, into the atmosphere, according to a report published today. Rishi Sunak will announce up to £242 million in bilateral assistance to Ukraine at the G7 summit, his office said on Wednesday, to support immediate humanitarian energy and stabilisation needs for Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, on an unannounced visit to Saudi Arabia on Wednesday, said he discussed preparations for a peace summit this weekend with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. On Wednesday, the Ukrainian military said it had hit 3 Russian surface-to-air missile systems in Moscow-occupied Crimea overnight, its second reported strike on air defences on the peninsula this week. Strikes targeted an S-300 system and 2 more advanced S-400 systems near Belbek and Sevastopol, Ukraine's general staff said. A fleet of Russian warships arrived in the Bay of Havana on Wednesday, in a visit seen as a show of strength amid tensions with the West over support for Ukraine. Maureen, that's quite an interesting update this evening. Is there anything in there that you'd like to highlight?
Well, it's just wide-ranging about the fighting that still goes on in various parts of Ukraine, but also highlighting the upcoming G7 and whether the G7 will initiate taking measures against those companies that are still doing, international companies that are still doing business with Russia, and perhaps imposing fines or sanctions on these companies. I think it really is important pressure is kept up because business will be business and will want to do business wherever and whenever. And unless there's some, they know that there are going to be some sanctions against them, then they will not bother representing the views of the West, that Russia should be seen as a pariah state. Of course, it's taken a bit of a back seat on mainstream media in the UK at the moment, but it's still possible to get some information on other outlets, which is great.
Thank you, Maureen. I'm just intrigued as what do you think about the the bit of the item which was about the G7 and Trump? What was it? The expression de-Trumpifying anything that they decide?
Yes, it'll be interesting to see whether they're able to do that and make decisions now for the longer term, which would tie Trump's hands if, God forbid, he is to be the next president of the United States, because we know that he is in cahoots with Putin on all sorts of things, including interfering in elections. So it is important that they are looking ahead to see what can be done to nullify any influence Trump may have.
I think he's also said that any funding from the US would stop immediately as well.
Well, I mean, Ukraine do need the weapons and the funds for everything now rather than further down the line. And just at D-Day celebrations, I was thinking, that even in the Second World War, and I was going around the Imperial War Museum recently, that the US are often very late to the table when it comes to wars, and then they come in with a great flourish. And I hope lessons have been learned in that, and that we need to shut down Russia and its invasion in Ukraine sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Maureen. So I'll move on to the latest from Israel and Gaza. At least 37,232 Palestinians have been killed and 85,037 have been wounded in Israel's attacks on Gaza since October the 7th, Gaza's health ministry has said. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that some of the amendments proposed by Hamas to the United States proposal for a truce in Gaza are not workable, but efforts to reach an agreement are continuing. Excuse me. G7 leaders meeting in Italy for a 3-day summit to discuss global affairs will discuss a Gaza ceasefire. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said President Biden will push G7 allies to back continuing Gaza ceasefire negotiations and press Hamas to accept the UN-backed ceasefire plan. The UN's Relief Agency for Palestinians, the largest aid organisation operating in Gaza, has said Israeli authorities are frequently preventing it from delivering aid and hampering its operations in the territory. We are getting very few positive responses to our requests for aid delivery and permits to move around Gaza, said Tamara Al-Rafai, the Director of External Relations for UNRWA. The war in Gaza has added to the number of people forcibly displaced globally, according to the UN's refugee agency, the UNHCR. The Israeli army has officially been added to a UN child harm blacklist. The UN verified 5,698 grave violations by the army against children in 2023. The Consulate General of Belgium in Jerusalem says representatives from the EU, Belgium, UK, Germany and Ireland met the Lawyers for Justice group to discuss their work on human rights issues. We are increasingly concerned about the challenges and pressure Palestinian human rights defenders are facing from various sides, it said in a post on X. The Israeli Public Broadcasting Corporation reports that the cabinet will discuss the escalation of hostilities in Israel's north this evening. Hezbollah has pledged to increase the intensity of its attacks on Israel after the Israeli army killed one of its senior commanders days ago. So, Maureen, there once again was a mention of the G7, but is there anything that you wanted to highlight from the Gaza update?
Well, I think the latest plans to end the conflict have happened since I was last on Broadcasting Scotland, and I really think it's important to try and make this one work for all sides and all the players to make this one work. I mean, I think Hamas are right to say that it's a long lasting and total ceasefire, not just for a few days or a few weeks, that it's got to be permanent. And it'll be interesting to see whether, as a result of the G7 hopefully coming together on this, that Israel might move on it, but ahima doots, as they say.
Thank you, Maureen. So now her daily update on the general election campaign. So for the Tories in both the UK and Scotland, Rishi Sunak is facing questions over whether his parliamentary aide, Craig Williams, knew about the general election timing when he placed a bet on the date 3 days before the election announcement. Um, Maureen, I'm just thinking about time, but is that something that you're aware of? Have you seen this?
Yeah, I saw it yesterday, I think, and I mean, I if I was Sunak, I would just be despairing about those around me. I mean, who advised him to go out and make an announcement in the rain? Who advised him that it was okay to come back from the D-Day celebrations or commemorations early? Um, Everything is just as if I think it's my son who said as if a Labour plant is in there him. But surely to goodness, election aides must know that this sort of thing, it's like, companies or employees in companies hearing rumours about takeovers and things and buying or selling on the stock market. This is absolutely a no-no, and I hope, the authorities come down hard on this person.
Yeah, and I don't want to linger on the Tories, but there was also, wasn't it? Didn't he say that when he was asked by a journalist if Sunak had been deprived of anything growing up, and he said that lots of things, but all he could think of as an example was something like Sky TV. Was it Sky TV? Something like that. Uh, yeah. So the next. I better move on to Labour in the UK and Scotland. So Labour launched its manifesto in Manchester today. Sir Keir Starmer has vowed to turn the page forever on held back potential as he put wealth creation and economic growth at the heart of Labour's manifesto. The manifesto itself was pared down to just 5 central missions, with core policies only on growth through building, education, crime, the NHS and clean energy. The Resolution Foundation has said that Tory post-election tax rises, plus Labour's manifesto plans, would take the tax burden to a record level. The think tank said that Labour's cautious approach to the public finances, which means a future Labour Chancellor could be left implementing significant tax rises and public service cuts over the next Parliament. The Institute for Fiscal Studies responded, saying that genuine change will require more extra spending than Labour manifesto proposes. So I think I've ran a few things together there, but yeah, okay, I'll keep going on Labour then because we are short of time. Ed Balls has described Labour's manifesto as a straitjacket that will make Keir Starmer's first year in office very difficult. And Jeremy Corbyn has accused Keir Starmer of rewriting history when Starmer said last night that he never expected Labour to win the 2019 election. Maureen, just to bring it into maybe Labour in Scotland, and a BBC Scotland general election debate last week, and as Sarwar told viewers, read my lips, no austerity under Labour. And the SNP today said that today Labour are set to announce more austerity of at least £18 billion. I'm a wee bit confused because it seems that austerity and tax rises, they're not the same thing, are they? I mean, if you raise taxes, that money could be spent on public services, and it's cuts to public services that I think most people associate with austerity. So it's an increase in taxes will pay. So I don't know. Can you maybe help straighten me out? I don't know.
Well, I wouldn't classify myself in any shape or form as an economist, but we know that austerity has been an economic and political choice of the Tories since 2010, and the only people who have benefited are Tories' pals, and we saw that particularly happening during COVID, which is absolutely disgraceful. So I've said on this Broadcasting Scotland many times when we've been talking about austerity, other countries do not follow austerity. And we saw post the 28 crash that in the United States, Obama pumped lots of money into the economy to kickstart it. And results were quick. The economy grew, and the States came out of recession or the effects of the crash quicker than if it had followed the same as Britain has done. And the same has happened during COVID. The EU pumped loads of money into the EU countries after COVID. So the problem, I think, is, and as I say, I am no economist, that the borrowing in the UK economy is already so high that I doubt that I can't see where there would be room for manoeuvre. But I think bold decisions need to be taken so that you can pump money into the economy to get road building, house building, and companies working to maximum capacity, hiring more people, new companies starting up, and all that sort of things. I think people forget about how important the public sector is in all. And so many private companies rely on the public sector taking action, like, as I say, road building and house building, etc. And also just giving the general feel that things are beginning to move so that people have more money in their pockets, more people are employed, they're in better wages, and that they're spending and thus helping other parts of the economy like retail and hospitality. So I don't know how Anna Sarwar said that with a straight face, that watch my lips, there will be no austerity, because none of the parties have shown us a way out of it.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm going to be cheeky and kind of stick with this a wee bit because I didn't really phrase my question very clearly. And I suppose I'm thinking when Anna Sarwar said, read my lips, there's no austerity under Labour, and then the SNP say today Labour are set to announce more austerity of at least £18 billion. How does the voter work out who's telling the truth?
Well, we heard yesterday, was it, or the day before, that people have a great distrust in politics and their politicians, and it's no wonder when you hear things like this, and stuff like BBC's fact checker and things like that. To be honest, I don't really even trust them to give the true picture. So I don't know, we just got to watch this space, but it'll be interesting to see whether Stammer's going to get away with it, isn't he? He's going to come in and have a budget and say, oh, the books were worse than we ever thought, and this is what we have to do, cut this, and raise taxes on various things other than national insurance, ordinary tax, income tax, and VAT, wasn't it?
Okay, thanks, Maureen. I'll try to quickly go through the other parties. So Plaid Cymru has launched its election manifesto titled For Fairness, for Ambition for Wales. The manifesto called for fair funding and economic fairness for Wales. The payment of the £4 billion Wales is owed under the Barnett formula for money spent by the UK government on the high-speed rail project, HS2. The Welsh Government in the Senate to have powers to set income tax bans and for thresholds, and promised fair play for patients and pledges several enhancement to NHS provision in Wales. Forgive me, my scanning there of that sentence was very poor. Plaid Cymru Plaid Cymru Westminster leader and candidate for Differ Merionid, Liz Saville-Roberts, said Labour was offering no radical manifesto. She said they're sticking to Tory fiscal rules, which means £18 billion will have to be cut. Saville-Roberts said more austerity but painted red. So, Maureen, it seems that Saville-Roberts agrees with the SNP on Labour's £18 billion cuts.
Yes, they must have read the Institute of Fiscal Studies report in the same way as the SNP have. That's a surprise, isn't it, that others other than the Tories and Labour can see right through. But Plaid Cymru recently have gone big on the lack of Barnett consequentials that have been coming to Wales, and I suspect it's the same in Scotland, although we don't make such a big play of it. But clearly we are not getting the Barnett consequentials that we should. I mean, if we had a decent mainstream media who did their homework, we should, every time there's a spending commitment in England, they should add that the Barnett consequentials on this will be such and such. But the BBC, for example, are so busy trying to confuse voters and people in Scotland who watch them between not being precise about whether they're talking about the Scottish government or the Westminster government, that we can't expect anything truthful. I don't think. But Plaid Cymru seem to be very upbeat in the general election. I don't know how well the pundits are saying that they will do, but I hope people like Saville-Roberts get back.
Thank you, Maureen. So we're really tight in time, but I'm going to go on with the SNP yesterday unveiled billboards the length and breadth of the country displaying the message Scotland back in Europe as we should be, as Scotland prepares for its first game at the Euro 2024. The SNP leader John Swinney unveiled the message in Edinburgh today, arguing Scotland rejoining the EU as an independent country is the next best thing to the Scotland team winning the Euros. So, Maureen, I'm just wondering, how successful do you think that will be as an SNP, for the SNP to link Scotland in the Euros with Brexit, which is kind of what it seems to imply? Is that going to work?
Well, I did say good luck to the boys, so I suppose it was tempered a bit. I mean, the mainstream media in Scotland have been going overboard on this, as they do, and then often Scots, are feeling totally dejected by Saturday. But I think this time, even although we don't win against Germany, and we may well do, there's still a chance of beating the other countries. So, best of luck. Why shouldn't we be backing our boys in Europe? Our boys, especially Stephen Flynn, is a member of the Tartan Army, so perhaps he had some input into this one, shall we say.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. So the next item is a new report by the Resolution Foundation has said that pensioners and people on disability benefits are the winners from radical changes to the welfare system made by the Tories over the last decade, while working age families are losing out by thousands of pounds every year. The Conservatives' 14-year overhaul of social security has shifted spending away from children and housing to supporting elderly people and broken the link between entitlement and need for some of the poorest households in the country, the report says. The size of the welfare state has increased slightly from 10% of GDP in 2007 and 8 to 11.2% in 2024-25. This has been driven by the rising cost of state pension commitments and disability and incapacity benefits, researchers found. These payments account for more than 90 pence of every £1 spent on welfare. However, changes to the welfare state have been felt unevenly across the population, according to the report. Pensioners have gained on average £900 a year, while working age families have lost an average of £1,500 a year. The hardest hit groups since 2010 have been out of work households receiving benefits who have lost on average £2,200 a year, and large families of 3 children or more who are worse off by £4,600 on average. Apart from pensions and disability, apart from pensions and disability benefits, expenditure on welfare is set to fall from 4.1% to 3.9% of GDP between 2024-25 and 2028-29, the Resolution Foundation said. While this represents a modest rise in spending of £1.6 billion in real terms, that amount may not be enough to address the severity of poverty and housing instability caused by earlier cuts. There is substantial, as a quote, there is substantial evidence that core levels of benefit are inadequate, the Resolution Foundation said. The next UK government will be responsible for the rollout of the two-child limit introduced in April 2017, which prevents parents from claiming child tax credit or universal credit for more than 2 children. This will push 51% of families with 3 or more children into poverty by 2028-29, according to the Resolution Foundation. The two-child policy and rape clause was introduced by the Conservative government under David Cameron, but the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has refused to repeal it. So, Maureen, this is along with how hard it is for young folk to get onto the housing ladder because they can't afford to save for a deposit, plus high sky rents and rental sector, which is why so many young folk have to stay with their parents at present. Do the Conservatives really actively dislike young people, or are they just more enamoured by older folk who are more likely to vote and also more likely to vote Tory? And on that, even when it comes to the actual voting process, my over 60 free bus pass here in Scotland counts as photo ID in a polling station, while the equivalent bus pass, I think I'm right in saying, for under 22s doesn't. So have they really just got it in for young people?
I think it's what will happen on polling day is very, very worrying. I wonder whether younger people will even bother to try and go to the polling station, because if you haven't got a passport or a driving licence, I'm not sure what else you can take along. And most pensioners, people over 60, have a bus pass. So it's really, really worrying, this. And I know we try and bring it up on the doorsteps when we can, but I think the UK government, have been very lax in broadcasting and publicising what you have to bring along. In terms of that report from the Resolution Foundation, this is in a context of the fact that pensions in the UK are still lower than most European countries. So it's not a case of giving the impression that those on pensions are getting a lot of money. They're not. And, adult disability payment, for example, is something like £80, 88 a week, or around that figure. So it's not a lot of money. However, the UK as a whole has got a problem with people not returning to work post-COVID, and a UK government will have to decide what sort of measures they're taking to get people back to work. But, I know people who are not in work, and, they've got no one to help them write a CV. The job centres locally have been closed, and it's really difficult if you're not savvy with a computer to find out where the work is. So I am not blaming in any way those who are out of work, but I think the system needs to be geared up to help people get back to work, because the jobs are there, as we know, but the access, I think the training and things is there in many cases, but access to it is difficult.
Thanks, Maureen. And time really is up against us, but I'd really like to hear what you have to say about that fact about the two-child policy and rape clause introduced by the Conservative government under Cameron, and now Keir Starmer's said that he refused to repeal it. So that means that the Scottish government is going to have to continue mitigating it.
Mm.
You got any quick thoughts on that?
I would have thought that if Keir Starmer was in any way, shape, or form going to try to show that he was different from the Tories and not just the red Tories, change the colour, doing something on the rape clause and the two-child payment would have been something that many people would have given him the benefit of the doubt for. And I think this goes back to the question about people being sick to death of politics and having a distrust of politicians. They're really not prepared to be bold and different, and it's a case of Starmer not upsetting the apple cart in any way, shape, or form, and just relying on people thinking the Tories are bad and past their sell-by date, and that people will change. But there's still a long way to go in the campaign.
Yes, thank you, Maureen. So the next item is the Deputy First Minister, Kate Forbes, made a statement to the Scottish Parliament today to explain the current position on European structural and investment funds and to refute allegations that the Scottish Government had failed to spend money which had been allocated by the European Union. Since Brexit, Scotland can no longer apply for new European structural and investment fund grants. And we've got a video of the Deputy First Minister speaking today in Holyrood.
Minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week there were various reports in the media about Scotland's use of European structural and investment funds. These were inaccurate and misleading. My statement today is to clarify the position as it stands now, and I'll make a further statement once the programme has actually closed and the final calculations have been completed and published. As I said last week in the Chamber, neither I nor the Parliament's own Information Centre recognise the figures that have been quoted. And so let me be clear today about the latest position. The maximum amount allocated to Scotland by the European Commission for European Structural and Investment Fund projects is €783.4 million. That's around £669 million. It's important to remember that the European Commission allocates and pays funding to Member States in euros. We then allocate and spend funding on projects in sterling. Now, 60% of the allocations that the Scottish Government have made have been to local government. The rest were largely to public bodies such as Nature Scot, Skills Development Scotland, who delivered excellent green infrastructure and skills training programmes respectively. The burden of implementing, delivering and agreeing the projects lies with our partners. At every turn, we have encouraged our partners to spend their allocations of EU funding and to meet the delivery targets. Unfortunately, in some cases, projects did contract. For example, the number of participants on structural funded apprenticeship programmes were impacted by the pandemic in 2020, the final year of the European Social Fund. We've also repeatedly asked all our partners to put forward new projects or to expand their existing ones to maximise our use of the funds. Some proposed projects did not meet the European Commission's strict eligibility criteria. And here it's important to note four things. First of all, the European Commission's requirements are very stringent. They only fit a limited number of projects and they cannot be used for core services. Secondly, because it requires match funding, it hasn't always been easy, especially for the third sector, to complete the projects. And then lastly, because the partners have to commit the funding and then claim a refund from the Scottish Government, it hasn't always been the first source of funding that our partners have opted to use. So any suggestion that the funding could have just been used for any and all public expenditure, as I've heard in the Chamber and may well hear shortly, just isn't accurate. The funding cannot relieve pressure on day-to-day spending caused by austerity. It does not work that way. Many factors will influence the final outturn position, and it's simply misleading to forecast at this point what the final outturn position will be.
So, Maureen, in relation to that statement, this evening, while preparing for this, I saw headlines that said that Kate Forbes has blamed councils for the SNP government losing out on more than £100 million of EU funding due to incompetence. Is that the correct conclusion for those headlines to make?
You know, EU funding was really welcome, and the UK government's fund, I think it's called the Levelling Up Fund, has done nothing to try and match the amount of money that Scotland in particular got from EU funding. But it is really tight in terms of the criteria that they impose. I remember, for example, that the new harbour in Aberdeen, the South Harbour, was getting a load of money from European funds. I'm not sure which fund it was, and the European Investment Bank. And because the main contractor pulled out, it was touch and go whether it could continue. So the idea that the opposition parties are saying that the government could just be, throwing this money left, right and centre is totally and utterly wrong. And it would be a good idea, as I will, to watch the whole of that statement and the questions that come from the opposition to clarify this point. And it's still has time up. The other point that I want to make is it shows you how really tight funding is, both in central government and local government, when that money has to be match funded. And match funding means exactly that, £1 for £1. And councils in particular who are stretched, as indeed as central government, finding that money and not allocating it to something else, a really difficult decision to make. So I see that Scotland in general, whether it be local or national government or NGOs or Quangos or whatever, are finding it really difficult to make use of these funds. But I'm sure come 2025, we'll make sure that we in Scotland, as we usually do, that we make use of the money, good use of the money before the funding expires. And of course, if we'd still been in the European Union, I'm sure some accommodation would have been made, but we're not, as we know.
And again, just really quickly, so the criticisms of the Scottish Government are that the money could have been spent on core services. Kate Forbes said that that's against the rules and couldn't have been done. And also it's third parties that maybe couldn't meet the criteria, couldn't get the match funding to secure it. So it's not the Scottish Government. Have I understood that correctly? Or?
That's my understanding too, Brian, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So our next item is lorry drivers could start rejecting jobs transporting goods from continental Europe to the UK unless delays are reduced and driver conditions improved at post-Brexit border posts, the biggest trade body for Dutch hauliers has warned. Transport on Logistiek Nederland, TLN, which represents 5,000 Dutch transport companies, said its members were facing average waits of more than 4 hours in Britain because of the new checks brought in after the UK's exit from the EU, with some being held at border posts for up to 20 hours. It described the facilities that drivers were forced to wait in as leaving a lot to be desired and said most border facilities only offered water with nowhere for drivers to get food or drink. In a 4-page report outlining drivers' experiences, the association said, "We are increasingly receiving reports from hauliers that their drivers no longer want to drive to the UK unless conditions improve." The report went on to list a series of problems Dutch lorry drivers and drivers had experienced since the government brought in border checks for plant and animal products on the 30th of April. The checks, which have been put in place to stop diseases coming into the UK, like foot and mouth, take place at the designated border control posts near ports such as Killingholme, Harwich and Felixstowe. The biggest is an inland government-run facility at Sevington in Ashford, which serves the port of Dover despite being 22 miles away. TLN has raised concerns about the delays and poor conditions greeting drivers at these posts and called for the UK government and port authorities to provide good and decent facilities for drivers. The TLN report also highlighted a number of other problems with border processes, including reports from Dutch hauliers that thousands of pounds of plant imports had been damaged as a result of careless handling by port staff when loading and unloading goods. The Netherlands was the UK's third largest trading partner by imports last year, with more than £65 billion of goods being transported. One of the biggest categories of products moved from the Netherlands to the UK is plants and cut flowers, with imports for these products reaching €2.1 billion for the first 3 months of 2024. TLN called for better training for inspectors and border staff who load, and for drivers to be allowed to assist and instruct port staff on how best to unload and load the lorries. So Maureen, when I was trying to do a bit of digging on this before preparation for the show, I came across, I thought I was reading a piece about the current situation from the Financial Times. It turns out it was actually dated from the 9th of May 2021. And this article was about how there was an exodus of EU lorry drivers from the UK since Brexit, which left British haulage industry facing an acute staff shortage and a looming crisis for industrial retail deliveries. That was all about the just-in-time supply chain issue at the time, I think. So again, this just highlights that Brexit is something self-inflicted, brought on by voters in the EU referendum.
Yes, I remember that crisis of lorry drivers, and I think, did we not, was there not something like 800 lorry drivers were allowed exemptions to come into the UK or something, if my memory serves me correctly. But you can understand it if you've ever been to Dover or I presume any of the other ports. The queue of lorries is absolutely huge. Because of Brexit, a lot of these lorries are going back empty because we're not sending as many goods to Europe. So to be stopped on the way back when you've got really nothing to declare on your lorry is really difficult. But of course, you can't skip the queue. I mean, it is absolutely vital that we make sure that no diseases are coming in. But we had diseases before Brexit. See that the checks on that are any different pre-Brexit as post-Brexit, but I stand to be corrected on that. So I'm not surprised. You know, things like plants and flowers are time sensitive, and I was just thinking, maybe I'm blaming the wrong people when I see so many plants outside supermarkets nearly dying. Maybe it's not the supermarket's fault. It's perhaps that they haven't been watered on the way to the UK from Holland. So, you know, maybe I'll look at it in a different way now. But yes, it's purely and utterly a result of Brexit. And if we don't get goods in from Europe, then we're going to be paying more on the open, get them from further afield, which of course doesn't help with climate change.
And and of course, this thing about Brexit is this thing about trade. It's a two-way street, isn't it? So this item was about Dutch drivers, and as you say, products coming in from the EU that have got to get to the markets quickly if profits are going to be maintained. But the Scottish seafood industry suffered in trade the other way, again simply due to Brexit. So it really just is a disaster, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's taken ages and ages to get some sort of a workable way of getting our seafood to the continent, because it has meant the paperwork involved has been huge, and small firms, you know, couldn't afford to do the paperwork. So what happened was that a lot of it was taken together so that you could put it in bulk, but even because it came from different sources, it wasn't straightforward. I don't have an update on how that's going now, but I know that there was a huge amount of work done by the processing sector locally in my old constituency, for example, and it was just a nightmare to work. And some of the companies, quite a few, just haven't been exporting to France anymore like they were previously. So yes, that has totally shrunk for our wonderful produce.
Yes, and of course we think back to all the things that we were told about how the, frictionless trade would, frictionless borders would be maintained, and that we held all the cards, etc., etc. But I best move on, unless there's something that you desperately want to say, Maureen.
No, and of course, Brexit is not its fair share of airing in these leaders' debates because the main parties, Tory and Labour, just don't want to talk about it.
Yes, so it's going to be an interesting thing to watch, as you say, in the upcoming debates. So Hungary has been ordered to pay a €200 million, that's a £169 million fine, for its refusal to uphold the rights of asylum seekers in what was described as an unprecedented breach of EU law by the bloc's highest court. The European Court of Justice in Luxembourg also ordered Budapest to pay €1 million a day until it complies with EU laws guaranteeing refugees the right to claim asylum inside the Hungarian borders. In a major judgment issued today, the court said Hungary had shown deliberate evasion in applying EU policy, which it described as a quote, an unprecedented and exceptionally serious infringement of EU law and a significant threat to the unity of EU law and to the principle of equality of the member states. The fine was higher than sought by the European Commission, which took Hungary to the Luxembourg court. Judges also identified aggravating circumstances, including the repeat behaviour that contributed to the severity of the fine. Responding to the judgment, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, described the court's ruling as outrageous and unacceptable and added, "It seems that illegal migrants are more important to Brussels bureaucrats than their own European citizens." The judgment relates to a 2020 ruling that found Hungary had broken EU migration law by limiting the rights of refugees and migrants to claim asylum in numerous ways, including by holding asylum seekers in transit camps at Rozge and Tompa on its border with Serbia. Hungary closed the container camps and argued it had complied with the ruling. In 2020, it passed a law requiring asylum seekers to make a declaration of intent at a Hungarian embassy in a non-EU country before entering the country. As a result, almost no one can claim asylum in Hungary. Authorities received just 30 applications in 2023. In comparison, Cyprus, with a population 10 times smaller, received 12,000 applications that year, according to the EU Agency for Asylum. In its ruling, the court said Hungary's 2020 migration law was in breach of EU asylum law and the underlying Geneva Conventions that guarantee the rights of refugees, including non-refoulement not being returned to danger. So, Maureen, I'm so tempted to make comparisons between this item and the current Westminster government and its Rwanda policies, but that would be detracting from what this story is about. So Hungary's been accused of systematically ignoring EU asylum rules. Is it fair to say that Hungary's wrongdoing unfairly puts more pressure on other EU member states who have to take care of migrants unlawfully expelled by Hungary? The breach seriously undermines the basic EU principle of solidarity and sharing responsibility. Do you think?
I think have secured their borders to the east so much that people just can't get in now at all, even into other EU countries. And, you know, we know that, as you said, with Cyprus, most come in through the Mediterranean. But we must remember that Viktor Orban is very right-wing, a friend of Putin's, and for years now has been trying to, what would I say, test the bounds of European law a lot. And this refugee matter is just the latest in a long line, and at last the EU and the European Court of Justice have clamped down, if you like, on Orban, and it'll be interesting to see what it's it's however many million euros a day. So it'll be interesting to see what his reaction is. I don't know what the European Parliament election results were in Hungary. I know that the country is deeply divided, but it will, as I say, be interesting to see what Orban's response to this will be.
Thank you, Maureen. So the next item is the number of people forced out of their homes around the world last year was the equivalent of the population of London, according to the UN's Refugee Agency. The latest annual assessment from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that's the UNHCR, said a sharp rise in the number of people forcibly displaced during 2023 had brought the total to a record high of more than 117 million. Conflicts were largely to blame, with many, such as those in Ukraine and Sudan, showing little sign of ending. Widespread violence meant that the 8.8 million people forcibly displaced in 2023, nearly the same population as the UK's capital, eclipsed the previous record set the year before after a series of year-on-year increases over the past 12 years. In total, 1.5% of the world's population is now forcibly displaced, nearly double the proportion of a decade ago. The UNHCR, which said its figures included refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people and others in need of international protection, warned that the total had continued to increase in the first 4 months of this year and was already likely to have exceeded 120 million, more than twice the population of Italy. Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, said, "Behind these stark and rising numbers lie countless human tragedies. That suffering must galvanise the international community to act urgently to tackle the root causes of forced displacement." The UN agency said a fifth of those forcibly displaced were now in the poorest countries in the world, such as Chad and Sudan. The UNHCR also found that a disproportionate number of children were affected, with minors taking up to 40% of all forcibly displaced people, despite accounting for just 30% of the world's population. During the year, the global refugee population increased by 7% to reach 43.4 million, driven by conflict in Gaza, with 6 million Palestinian refugees among the total, and in Sudan, where 10.8 million people were forcibly displaced at the end of last year, a number growing by thousands each day. Maureen, these figures are staggering, aren't they? And again, this is not new. The item referred to how this has been going on for about 12 years now. Again, I came across a website from the UN, a web page on the UN's website, dated June 2023, but referring to what had happened at the end of 2022. And it said, the UNHCR calls for concerted action as forced displacement hits a new high of 110 million. And then, of course, there's going to be climate-driven upheaval, which is set to get worse in the coming years. So what can be done to alleviate this problem? How do we foster collective action internationally?
Yes, and that's what it has to be. And you wonder whether United Nations agencies are really doing all that they can to help in this regard. But of course, they work on what the politicians tell them to, and clearly most of it doesn't seem to register at these international meetings. But people have to be helped at source. And, you can also see that it's really difficult to intervene internationally in places like Chad and Sudan and Myanmar, for example. How do international agencies intervene in that? I mean, we saw how difficult it's been for UNRWA to continue its work in Gaza, for example. So the only way to stop mass migration like this is to try and get other countries on board to stabilize their economies, increase the economic output of their economies, decrease the inequality that exists in these countries, stop corruption. And all these things take an awful lot of work. And it has to be constant, because as soon as you turn your back, the corruption starts again, for example. So it is a really difficult situation, but it does require redistribution of wealth, not only within countries, but across the world. And it's not something that's going to be solved overnight in 1 decade or whatever. And I'm not confident that enough of our politicians see that international work as important.
Thank you, Maureen. And just quickly, just from a thought popped into my head there just now, and I'm curious to find out what you think. Would you agree that Brexit isn't really going to help this international cooperation either?
No, I mean, Britain has got to be at all the tables, and the EU and agencies, do a huge amount of work in this area, but it's got to be cooperative. I mean, we can't all be going to the same country, for example, and delivering aid. And that's why, Scotland's policy of concentrating on 3 or 4 countries solely to help with aid rather than spreading it wider is a really good policy. I know that there are lots of good things happening in Malawi, for example, but it doesn't just require people, for example, MSPs, for example, to Malawi, after there's been an election, and encourage and see how awful corruption is and bribery is, because, and you can see it doesn't happen in our country, and our citizens are more well off, because it doesn't register just for a minute. It requires constant action. And with austerity, I don't know when the last time a group from the Scottish Parliament went to Malawi to help out, although the NGOs still do a huge amount of work.
Thank you, Maureen. Would you be able to spare a couple of minutes if we end up going over time this evening? Yeah? Okay, thank you. I hope our colleagues in the control room are okay with that as well. So the final item is sub-postmasters in Scotland who were wrongly convicted as a result of the Post Office Horizon scandal will be automatically exonerated tomorrow, that's the 14th of June 2024. The Post Office Horizon System Offences Scotland Act received royal assent today and comes into force tomorrow. The legislation was passed in the Scottish Parliament on the 30th of May 2024 to deliver justice to victims as swiftly as possible and to enable them to access the UK Government's financial redress scheme. Working with the Crown Office, the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission and the Post Office, the Scottish Government will notify those affected and ensure police and court records are amended. There is also a route for victims to bring their cases to the attention of ministers. Justice Secretary Angela Constance has written an open letter to sub-postmasters setting out next steps. The Justice Secretary said, "This legislation automatically exonerates sub-postmasters who were convicted of crimes of dishonesty that they did not commit due to the Post Office's faulty Horizon IT system, meaning they are eligible to access the redress scheme." She went on to say, "Of course, no amount of compensation can fully mend the lives that were torn apart by this miscarriage of justice. I do hope, however, that this legislation goes some way to righting the terrible wrongs of the past." She continued, "I will be writing to those affected to tell them their convictions have been quashed and ensuring court records are changed, so the victims of this scandal can have their good names restored as quickly as possible. They have already waited too long for justice." So, Maureen, if I've understood this correctly, the bill automatically exonerates wrongly convicted sub-postmasters the day after assent is granted. That's tomorrow, as the piece said. So I guess the exoneration is instant from tomorrow. People wouldn't have to do anything, it's automatic. But from your experience when you were in Holyrood, how long do you think will it take for Horizon victims to, how long will they have to wait for that financial redress, or how soon will it be delivered? So, or what has the Scottish, what has to happen before folk actually see money from the UK government's financial redress scheme?
Well, I can't think of anything comparable in the Scottish Parliament when I was there. There probably is something, but it's not springing to mind. But, you know, this tomorrow could have been much earlier if the Westminster Parliament had included Scotland in its legislation, which it deliberately didn't. And while exoneration must bring some relief to the families and must probably reignite grief in those families where the postmasters and mistresses have subsequently died, it must be awful for them. And in terms of monetary redress, I think it's going to take years and years still. I mean, the Post Office inquiry will likely have to conclude before anything happens, and we don't know when there's a date for that, and the judge's decision report will have to be published. That can often take ages and ages. So an incoming government, will it be top of its inbox? Hopefully, but yes, I still think this has got a long way to run.
Thank you, and I dare say it sounds, again, it just makes me think of the WASPy women situation. They seem to have, they chime with each other. Maureen, so we've gone over time. I thought that was an important story that we should definitely include. So thank you for letting us do that. Yeah, and thank you again for giving us your time and your expertise in general. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's it for this evening, but before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our focus must now move on to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. But thank you again to our guest, Maureen Watt, and to you, the viewers at home. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.